The Ontario government is considering barring the installation of bike lanes where car lanes would be cut as a result. In Toronto, the topic of bike lanes in particular is divisive. As CBC's Lorenda Redicop takes us through what the government is considering.
CBC News has learned the Doug Ford government is looking at barring bike lanes if a lane of vehicle traffic has to be taken out. We first investigated after we received a stack of internal government documents from a source. In it, details of the proposal to prohibit bike lanes in those cases where a car lane must be removed. Government sources confirmed the PCs are considering it, but the government chose not to respond to our initial story. So I asked the Transportation Minister out at a separate announcement. He didn't directly answer on this, but talked about tackling gridlock.
So we have to look at a multitude of options. We have to look at what will work for the city, what will work for people across this province.
Bike lanes would normally be a power of municipalities, not the province. Toronto's mayor said she hasn't heard anything on this so far from the government. She gave the example of one busy area for bikes, Bloor Street downtown.
Imagine everyone that is on a bike, if they are all driving, that intersection, nothing will be moving.
But there's a section of Bloor West where the full separated bike lane is a hot issue. People blaming it for the traffic.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to see the province stepping in. It's been here, especially, it's been atrocious. It's been nothing short of horrendous. The design and implementation of this lane has been awful.
This area is also in Etobicoke, near the Premier's house. No secret how he feels.
Get rid of those bike lanes on Bloor and Etobicoke.
But one expert says studies have shown bike lanes don't cause congestion and says it would be a mistake to put a proposal like this in place province-wide.
That's an extreme measure that will have very little, if any, impact on traffic, but could have a huge impact on cyclist safety. We've had 6 deaths on the roads of Toronto alone just in 2024.
But he says with many drivers, especially in the suburbs where Doug Ford and his government want to win votes, this could be popular.
This government has signaled that the car is king. You can win elections in Ontario by showing that you're supporting driving.
The Green Party calls this an unserious proposal from an unserious government that doesn't have a plan to tackle gridlock, while the NDP says this is politics that plays with people's lives. Sources also confirm the government is looking at speeding up priority highway projects, including Highway 413, allowing construction 24/7. Now, specifically on Highway 413, the government is also looking at changing the environmental assessments so that they wouldn't be required for early works on that highway. All being looked at, potentially part of legislation coming this fall. Lorenda Redicop, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, to dig deeper into this, we are joined by Stephen Farber. He is a professor of transportation at the University of Toronto, and he joins us now from Toronto. Stephen, thank you so much for making time.
Thanks. It's great being here.
So if this legislation is pursued, I mean, it is a big if, but if it is, and it passes, let's say, and it's prevented that you can't turn a car lane into a bike lane, what do you think? Will that help with congestion? You could clearly hear some people in Lorenda's story there who were pretty confident that bike lanes were part of the issue.
Yeah, I think that there could be some very short-term benefits in places that have potentially really slowed down in the short term because of the change in the network configuration. But over time, what we do find is that people's travel behavior adapts to the installation of new infrastructure like bike lanes, and those travel time hassles do tend to evaporate over time as people adapt. And, you know, especially with bike lanes, the real benefit that comes with them is that for every cyclist that is out there using a bike, you know, that's potentially one less driver in a car being part of that traffic problem. So most cities really do see bike lanes as an essential part of like the future of their mobility systems that would provide safety and alternatives for non-car use, which is exactly where we need to be going in the future if we want more people to travel without being part of the congestion in the city.
Stephen, when you think about a city like Toronto or others, I don't mean for this to be so Toronto-centric, but a city where the road infrastructure is already there, so you're not starting from scratch. If you want to put in bike lanes, what are the options? Are there options that exist that, don't require taking away from lanes that vehicles are in that are also cost effective?
Look, I think the most efficient routes along, to get from A to B in most cities or most places in Ontario would be along our grid networks that our roads currently follow right now. There are some limited opportunities for off-road cycle paths through parks and ravines and hydro corridors, but that represents a really small segment of where where the opportunity is to create safe biking routes. And there's a wide array of street designs that exist in this province. And of course, as you get into newer suburbs, the rights of way, the width of the streets, not just the road lanes, but then also the grassy areas next to the road and the sidewalks, and then more grass before the suburban houses. And so there is a lot more room there to build bike lanes off of city streets and without removing traffic. But in the older parts of the city, and especially in parts of the city where there really are great options and great potential for cycling to be a reasonable option for getting around, this is precisely where we don't have other choices but to reconfigure the streets and take some space away from cars and parking and provide safety and efficiency to cycling, and I would add transit priority lanes into that as well. So go ahead.
Well, I just wonder, do you have a sense of how much has been taken away from drivers in the city of Toronto in recent years? Because, I mean, for those people who have seen it happen in front of them, that's what they're focused on, right? But is that the case across the city, or are there other examples of finding other ways around it?
Yeah, so I don't have the figures on it. I think it's a good thing for us to come up with. I think that the overall loss in road capacity has been very, very minimal as a percentage of total road space. And if you actually look at how much space is allocated to different road users, we see right now that there's far more space allocated to drivers than there are to the other modes of transportation on our city streets. And if you look at it as a ratio of who uses our streets and how much space is allocated, there's no question that most streetscapes are maybe 80 to 90% of the space devoted to moving cars. And when we talk about moving cars, those cars are usually big, empty cars with one person in them at a time. If you compare that, maybe they're only 10, 20, 30% of the overall road users on a lot of the streets where we see bike lanes being put in. So sure, there is a loss in bike lanes for Torontonians, but really this is what part of an equitable reallocation of that precious space resource in order to achieve really important goals like safety and alternatives and opportunities for folks not to be part of the traffic and have options not to drive.
Stephen, great to get your perspective on this today. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That was Stephen Farber, a professor of transportation at the University of Toronto.